All right, Shabbos, say good morning. Good morning, and let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsor for Tuf Shin Pei Hey, our annual Talmud Torah sponsor, the Tulsa Mishpach of Eretz Yisrael, for dedicating all the Shuman Droshos this year as his chus. For all of Am Yisrael, our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Baruch and Karen Gold, formerly of Baltimore, now of Lakewood, New Jersey, in memory of Baruch's father, Bruce Gold, Zichron Lebrach. We obtain the merit of our Talmud Torah. The Neshama will have an aliyah. The family in the Chamu should be zochem Eretz Hashem to see the release of more of our hostages this Shabbos, and Eretz Hashem in the coming days, and our holy soldiers should be successful. B'chol ma'aseh yedehem. With that, let us begin. Today's daf is Nun Beis 52. We are picking up on Nun Aleph Amud Beis 51b. 51b. Did we get up to Rabbi Akiva Omer? Zomel. Okay, good. So the Gemara says, "Ela Zomel b'chlam." So again, let's pick up 2, 4, 6, 8, about 8 lines up from before it gets wide. So remember, again, still steeped in the conversation regarding Sreifa and who gets Sreifa. One of the interesting ideas that the Gemara now is espousing is Ela Zomel b'chlam nisas bo'ala. Mishum shneimar ba'asisem lo kasher zamam lasos la'achiv v'lo la'achoso divrei Rabbi Shmuel. Right. So I ended up literally like in the middle of Rabbi Shmuel's position. Again, the Gemara says like this: Rabbi Shmuel understands, and this is the conventionally understood approach as well, that halach l'maisa, the unique din of sreifa for a bas kohen, is only a din in her. It doesn't apply to her accomplice in the crime, right, to the man with whom she committed adultery, nor does it apply to the edim zomimin. Now again, remember, everyone is going to get a death penalty, right? So that in other words, the man with whom she commits adultery is also going to get a death penalty. The witnesses will also get a reciprocal death penalty, but they do not get her streifa. Her unique streifa is for her and her alone. Incredible. Rabbi Kiva says, "Achas arusa v'achas nesua yotzlas l'streifa." So Rabbi Akiva says, whether the bas kohen is an arusa or whether she is a nesua, either way, the punishment is going to be streifa. You might have thought that this applies even to a single woman. In other words, maybe bas kohen is held to such a high standard that halacha l'maisa, even if she commits an act of immorality as a single woman, maybe she's going to be subject to streifa. So we saw this already yesterday. So it says over here aviyah. It says in the previous context aviyah. It says over here aviyah by the case of bas kohen. It says aviyah in the context of incest. So the Gemara says, it says in both psukim aviyah, just like earlier it's talking about, again, act of immorality, where there is an element of marriage, so too again halacha l'maisa over here is talking about where there's a znus with an element of marriage. Amar Rabbi Shmuel. First wide line of us in the bottom of Nun Aleph Base 51b. Rabbi Shmuel says if that's the case, maybe we should say just like in one pasuk, the context is that she's a nara and she's an arusa. So too over here, the second pasuk should also be only applying if she's a nara and she's an arusa. Amar Rabbi Akiva Yishmael achi bas. Ubas anidoresh. So interestingly enough, for Rabbi Akiva, this is back to Rabbi Shmuel. The pasuk could have just said bas, but it says ubas, the vav. Now vav is usually a ribui, and vav comes to include. So what does it come to? So although the pasuk is talking about a nara who is an arusa, the extra vav comes to teaching that it includes all cases of a married bas kohen. So the Gemara says, Amalei, so Rabbi Shmuel says back to Rabbi Akiva. And he says like this, he says, interestingly enough, second wide line. Notes he's the Sreifa, so shkoyach, Yudarshan, ubas, Yudarshan above. So first of all, who says that's the correct drasha? So because Yudarshan, an extra above, therefore we're going to take this girl out for Sreifa. Now again, I just want to be clear. Remember, no one's disagreeing on the fact that there's a death penalty for adultery. Remember again, what's the disagreement over here? What's the death penalty? So the Gemara says, "Imashma lahavi es hanasua, hevi es hapnuya. V'imashma lahotzi es hapnuya, hotzi es hanasua." So the Gemara says like this: if we're going to darshan it to include an asua, then by definition also include a pnuya. right? Maybe it includes all types of bas kohen, even if she's unmarried. And if you're going to exclude a single girl, then perhaps you should exclude ultimately a nesua as well. Rabbi Akiva says as follows: Ahani gzera shava lemeute pnuya, v'ahani bas ubas lerabos esanasua. And Rabbi Akiva will say like this: the gzera shava will help to exclude a pnuya, that a single girl, a single bas kohen, is not subject to any of these halachos, and ultimately, again, the vav ubas, the extra riboy l'rabos es hanasua, comes to include the nesua. Rabbi Shmuel will say, "Midikamrle bas ubas shmamina hadrabe migzera shava." Rabbi Shmuel says, from the fact that we're saying bas ubas, it makes it sound like he's no longer holding with the gzera shava. Rabbi Shmuel, hi bas ubas my darish bey. So again, remember, Rabbi Akiva uses the ubas, the vav, to include all different cases of a bas kohen who's married. Rabbi Shmuel rejects that. But Rabbi Shmuel also has to admit to the fact that the Torah could have said bas kohen. Why does it say ubas? What does he do with the extra vav? So the Gemara says, "Mibai avuhi d'Shmuel bar Avin." It's very interesting. Lefishe matzinu shechalak hakasa b'scharim bein tmim lebali mumin yochol nachlok b'ibnosehen. So I'm going to thought like this. This is very interesting. I'm going to thought the same way. The Torah makes a distinction by kohanim, by male kohanim, between what we'll call blemished and unblemished kohanim. Right? We know there's a distinction that Allah a kohen who's a Baal Mum is not able to do the avodah. So there's a distinction between blemished and unblemished kohanim. I might have thought that same distinction applies to a bas kohen. Interesting, right? And maybe the din of bas kohen, specifically the din of streifa by a bas kohen, only applies to an unblemished bas kohen, to which the Gemara says, Talmud Lomar bas ubas. Therefore, the extra vav, there's a riboy, and to tell us that whenever there's a din that applies to a bas kohen, it doesn't make a difference. There's no din of mumin by a bas kohen, only a din of mumin by kohanim. Interesting, Rabbi Akiva. Where does Rabbi Akiva learn this out from? Rabbi Akiva mevehem makrivim v'hayu kodesh. Rabbi Akiva says we learn from the pasuk of v'hei makrivim, they will offer up the karbanos v'hayu kodesh, and they will be sanctified. Teaching us what? That the sanctity of a male kohen is fundamentally tethered to his we'll call it unblemished state. But that's only because that by male kohanim is an element of hakrava, of karbanos. But by a bas kohen, because there is no element of hakrava, of karbanos, therefore again, her status is independent of whether or not she has a mum. Incredible. Rabbi Shmuel would say, so again, Rabbi Shmuel says that from that, I might have thought that maybe the only people who have Kohen status are Kohanim themselves. Maybe their daughters don't have at all. To which the Gemara says, Kamash Malon, no. Okay. Good. Rabbi Shmuel, so both the top of the base, 52a. Rabbi Shmuel, hi es avia hi mechaleles, my darshibe. So what does Rabbi, this is incredible. So what does Rabbi Shmuel do with the phrase es avia hi mechaleles? What does he do with it? So the Gemara says, listen to this. Mibayle v'chidesanyo. So what do we need it for the following limud? What did we learn? So the Gemara says, listen to this. Hi Rabbi Meir Omer. What does it mean when the pasuk says that she profanes her father? What does that mean? This is incredible. Shem hayu noagin bo kodesh, noagin bo chol. The pasuk is actually telling us how to relate to the father of the bas kohen. So remember again, let's just play this out, right? So there's Rachel. Rachel is whatever, Arusa, Nesua, Teruvain, doesn't matter. Rachel is the daughter of Aaron. Aaron is a kohen. Rachel now commits adultery. So the pasuk says, through Rachel's adultery, esavia hi mechaleles, she profanes her father. What does it mean practically that she profanes her father? So the Gemara says, it means that her father's status changes as a result of her behavior. So for example, the Gemara says, Shem hayu bo noagin kodesh, if again they would normally treat him in a more, we'll call it, in a more exalted way, right, in a holy way. Noagin bo chol, they would treat him in a more mundane way. Kavod, if they would normally give him kavod. Noagin bo bizayon, they would treat him in a disparaging way. The idea is that because of the daughter's behavior, the father, again, to be clear, he's still a kohen. Right, he's still a kohen, and he can still do the avodah, but he's stripped of kavod. We don't give him kavod anymore. So the Gemara says, why is that? So the Gemara says, Omrim, we say, Arur zeh sheyalad. Right? Cursed is the person who birthed such a child. Arur zeh shegidal. Cursed is the person who raised such a child. Cursed is the person who, literally again, such a person, I guess literal translation, issued forth from their loins. So we'll say, this is Rav Ashi says, this is in accordance with who do we say, when a person is a Rasha and a person does terrible things, we call them a Rasha, the son of a Rasha, even though their parent may really be a tzaddik. Even though they really may be a Rasha ben Tzadika. So who is that? Kiman Kahai Tana, like this Tana. So we'll say this is a fascinating discussion. This definitely goes into the notebook of Daf Yomi topics that we need to find the time to really delve into a little bit. Because what the Gemara is saying over here is that there is parental culpability for the actions and decisions of a child. Right? And therefore, again, Rachel, the daughter, commits adultery. We say, Aaron, clearly there is something fundamentally flawed in the chinuch you gave your child. There's something fundamentally flawed in the home in which you raised your child. Because for a child to make these type of lifestyle decisions means that obviously, again, you did something wrong. You did something wrong. And the Gemara says over here, so that's what it means, this has an impact on the father. So now, father, we will no longer give you the honor you deserve because this is the child you raised. Cursed is the person who raised such a child. Cursed is the person. So I'll say, so I just want to point out, you'll find this fascinating, and I just want to point out that in Chazal themselves, there is such a fundamental machlokas about the liability or responsibility of parents for how their children turn out. And you see very different competing motifs in Chazal. And again, we know this as parents. There are times where a parent could do every single thing right, but yet my kid makes their own decisions. Right? Children become adults, and adults make their own decisions. And a parent might have done every single thing at every single juncture they were supposed to do. My kid is still going to make their own decision. But, on the other hand, it is also quite possible that the decisions our children make are absolutely steeped in the upbringing and the chinuch and the values or lack of values that we gave them. And that's a difficult pill to swallow because, the Gemara says, Shlomo Melech says in Koheles, Mu'uvas lo yuchal liskon, something that is bent, right? Something that is bent cannot be made straight. Shlomo Melech says. So the Gemara says, what does that mean, right? We live in a world that we hope in general in our Yiddishkeit that whatever I do wrong I could always fix. So what is he saying? That's bent cannot be made straight. So the Gemara says, Zeh shaholid mamzer. Zeh shaholid mamzer, right? So I always understood the Gemara literally. Which is, what does it mean Zeh shaholid mamzer? So a person has an illicit relationship, the result of that illicit union is a mamzer. No matter how bad you feel for what you did, right? No matter how much tshuva you do, you can't what? You can't undo it. The mamzer is there. So I'll tell you, as I get older and look back on raising a family, I feel like sometimes it's not just about a mamzer. What it also is a din in chinuch. Sometimes the other thing you can't undo is the way you raise your children. And the influences you allow into your home, the things you allow your children to do, don't allow your children to do, that you can't undo chinuch. And it's one of the hardest parts because often we learn to be a parent on the job. And I only realize my mistakes afterwards. So, excuse me for saying this, after I've created the mamzer. In other words, again, I'm not calling out kids, but you understand what I mean? After I made the mistakes, and now I realized I really made some significant mistakes. And the incredible part is, you can't undo it. You can't. Chinuch is one of those things where a lot of times, and again, I could go back and have open and honest conversations with my kids and say, I just want to tell you, those things that I did, they weren't right. They weren't right, and I want to be clear that they weren't right. But no matter how much I'm owed it to my kids that they weren't right, I've created the mamzer. I've created the flawed chinuch. I've created the flawed paradigms in the home, and I can't walk it back. So there's this so again, on one hand, there's this idea that a parent could do everything right, and a child still makes their own decisions. So who says that Rachel's actions reflect on her father, Aaron HaKohen? But again, there's also an approach in Chazal that says no. What a child does and how a child behaves and how a child leads his life is a direct reflection of the chinuch that he or she has received in the home growing up. Which is right? They're both right. There are elements of both of this, which is why, again, the chinuch we give our children, the example we set for our children, the behaviors we model for our children, the homes we create for our children, the lifestyles we create for our children, everything goes into the chinuch. And again, if it's good, great. But if it's flawed, the Gemara is telling us, we, the parent, is held responsible. Incredible. Let's go ahead. Zoom into Sanhedrin. Gemara says, "My time and Diktani zoom into Sanhedrin." Why does the Mishnah end off? It was interesting, right? Because the Mishnah ended off by saying this is the mitzvah of skila. So why does the Mishnah end off this way? Mishum Ditana Nigmar Hadin Motziin Oso L'Saklo. Because remember again, what did we say before? So before that if halacha l'maaseh was liable to skila, we take him out to skila. Beis skila hayag is this is the previous Mishnah, not the last Mishnah we did 2 Mishnahs ago. Beis skila hayag avash de kamos va'idi de kabay lemisna mitzvah sanis rafim tananam izum mitzvah sanis kalan. Because we'll say here's what's interesting. Even though really this Mishnah spoke about Arba Misos, but it was really following on the heels of the Skila Mishnah, right? So therefore we had Skila, then it went into Arba Misos, and then it wanted to close out the discussion of Skila. And that's why the Mishnah ends off by saying, Zu mitzvahs haniskalin. That's the end of the skila discussion, and I will say now we begin the sreifa. Here we go, Mishnah, mitzvahs hanisrafim. I will say this is pretty wild stuff. So what is sreifa? What is sreifa? Now I will say I just want to point out. I'm sorry before we go on. Halacha l'maisa. Sorry, what are we doing with the Bas Kohen? So the Rambam Paskes in Hilchos Isurei Bia Parakima Halacha Gimel. Bas Kohen shezinsa kishi eishes ish. Bein shehaya ba'ala Kohen, bein shehaya Yisrael, va'afilu haya ba'ala mamzer al nasin or shar mechavi lavin harezu b'sreifa. So we'll say the halacha is a Bas Kohen, whether she's an arusa or she's an asua, whether she's married to a Kohen, Levi, Yisrael, mamzer, nisin, Plishti, Givoni, whatever it is, right? So actually, that's not true. Has to be Jewish, right? So the mice again, her judgment for adultery is sreifa. However, ubala bechanek. Right? But yeah, I will say, but the halacha is the man with whom she commits adultery, and by extension also Rambam doesn't say it over here, but ultimately again, but Eidim Zomin as well will get chenek. Chenek, strangulation, is the normal punishment for adultery. So the only person who gets this unique punishment for adultery is the Bas Kohen herself, whatever, but everyone else involved chenek. Good, that's the Rambam. Mishnah, Mrs. Hanis Rafim. So we'll say, how do we administer the punishment of sreifa? Also, so we go ahead and we immerse him in manure up until his thighs. We immerse him in manure. Now, what's that? So Rashi says over here, we're going to see is we need to keep him immobilized. So the way we keep him immobilized, that he can't move around, is we put him in manure up until his legs, up until his thighs. That way he keeps him immobile. And we take a soft rope. We take a rough rope and we put it inside of a soft rope. So essentially take a rough rope, and then again on the inside of that rope is a soft rope. So the soft rope is going to go around the neck of the guilty party. V'korich al tzavaro, and we wrap it around his neck. So let's say Chas Shalom Ruvain is chayiv streifa. Step 1, put him in manure up to his knees, immobilize him. Step 2, take a 2-ply rope. The outside rope is a coarse rope. The inside rope is a soft rope. We're tying that around his neck. 2 people stand on either side of Ruvain, each one holding an end of the rope. And what happens? Each one pulls the rope towards him until what results? Until Ruvain is forced to open his mouth. Right? So the act of pulling the rope will force him to open his mouth. So we'll see what this expression means, but quite literally it means we ignite the wick, and we throw it down his throat. So I will say, so sreifa, interestingly enough, is we think of like a burning at the stake of a person. It's actually not what it is. We're going to see it's a pouring of molten lead down the throat of the person. That's sreifa. So we force it, he's immobilized, force his mouth open, and we pour the molten lead. It calls it a psil, we'll see, a wick, we'll see why he calls it then. It goes then down into his kishkas, and essentially he is killed from the inside, right? His insides are incinerated, right? He is incinerated internally. Rabbi Huda says, Rabbi Huda says, here's the problem. The problem is, well, there's many problems, right? But the problem over here, he says, is you're trying to administer the din of streifa, but you may end up what? You may end up strangling the guy, right? Which by the way, is a different misa, right? It's chenek. So the problem is if somebody is chayiv streifa and you end up giving him chenek, isn't that problematic? So what should you do? So the Gemara says, Ella, first white line of Ella poseach piv b'tzeves shelo b'tavaso. We take tongs and we pry his mouth open. Pry his mouth open. Umadlik es hapsila v'zarka l'soch piv v'yoredes l'soch me'av v'chomeres es b'nei me'av. Rather, what do? We use tongs. Now, obviously, somehow they must be immobilizing him also, right? Because if you're not immobilizing him, he's going to run, he's going to move, and the whole thing. Remember, again, the issue is the molten lead needs to go down his throat. Because if it doesn't go down his throat, then it's going to burn him on the outside, and that's not streifa. Streifa is internal incineration. So, but yet, Rabbi Huda says we can't do the rope thing because you risk strangulation. So instead, force his mouth open with tongues. I'm Rabbi Elazar ben Tzadok. Ma'asav as kohen achos shezinsa v'kifuach haviles muros. Rabbi Elazar ben Tzadok says as follows: one time there was a bas kohen who committed adultery and therefore against streifa. And what did they do? They surrounded her with branches, visarfuha, and they burnt her. They burnt her. So Rabbi Elazar ben Tzadok seems to be indicating that the din of streifa, ultimately again is actually burning someone. Burning someone, to which the Gemara says, Amrullah mipnei shelo haya bezin shelo osa shah baki. That was a mistake. That was a mistake. Now again, I will say, now remember again, it's a mistake in the manner of execution. It may not be a mistake in the execution itself. But the point that the Gemara is making is that was a misunderstanding of what sreifa was. Says the Gemara, my psila. So first of all, what does it mean when it's a wick? So Amarav Masna psila shal aver. It calls it a wick. It calls it a wick of lead. Now Rashi points out over here what they would do. So I'm sorry. Mishnah points out what they would do is they would take like a long piece of lead and they would mold it and they would melt it down. So they call it a psila because it was long. It resembled a wick. Okay, Minola. So we'll say. So first of all, where do we know this from? This is a little bit mind blowing because again, how do you know that sreifa means internal incineration? Where does that come from? So we'll say this is quite an interesting Gemara. Asya sreifa from the Adas Korach. We make a gzera shav of sreifa from Korach and his assembly. Remember again, Korach leads the rebellion against Moshe Rabbeinu, and again his assembly, some of them were swallowed up by the earth, and some of them were incinerated. If you look at Rashi says, Asya sreifa, ksiv hacha, be'esh tisaref, uksiv hasam asher ikrivu hasrufim, ma lahalon guf kaim. Look at what Naboth said. I remember again, part of what happened with Korach was that a bunch of people brought kitoras. The people who brought kitoras, because remember, everybody's jockeying for the position of Kohen Gadol, so whoever brought the kitoras was incinerated. Was killed by sreifa. So again, a large number of fowls were swallowed up by the earth. Others who brought the ketoras were incinerated. So the Gemara says, it says sreifa over here, it says sreifa by Korach. So the Gemara says, Mala halon sreifas neshama v'guf kayum, just like by Korach. So again, they were killed by internal incineration. Fire went into their body, killed them internally, but their bodies were still intact. Afkan sreifas neshama v'guf kayum. So too over here, the way sreifa is done is internal incineration, but the body remains intact. Okay, so that's the first opinion. Tanakama. Rabbi Elazar Amar Asya Sreifa from Ibnei Aaron. Now we learn Sreifa from Nadav and Avihu. Nadav and Avihu, remember again, also went ahead. Whatever they did, right? It's a big machlok is exactly what they did. But whatever they did was unsanctioned service of Hakadosh Baruch Hu, and they were killed. So the Gemara says, listen to this. Just like by Nadav and Avihu, fire incinerated them internally, but their bodies were intact. Afkan sreifas neshama v'guf kayim. So too over here again, So it's over here by Sreifa. So internally, ultimately, again, we incinerate the person internally, but the body remains intact. So I will say it's fundamental machlokes. So interesting, everyone is agreeing on the concept that Sreifa is internal incineration. What's the makar? Tanakama says Korach. Rabbi Elazar says Bnei Aaron. So Mar Mandial of Me'adas Korach Menale. So here's what's interesting. How do you know? In other words, the Torah tells us that the people who offered up the Ketores were burned, but how do you know that it's this internal incineration? Tichsev es machtos hachotim ha'ela benafsho sam shenes masham nisrefes the guf kayim. So okay, we darshan benafsho sam. So we darshan again that ultimately again internally, in other words, they were their nefesh, so to speak, their soul, which means just their internal life was snuffed out, but ultimately again their bodies were remained intact. The idach, the other opinion, who doesn't learn from here will say hahi streifa mamishi. No, they were literally burned. They were literally burned. Umay benafshosam. So what does it mean when the pasuk says benafshosam? Shenis chayv v'streifa iskei nafshosam. That they were chayv streifa ultimately again because of what they did, right? Because of iskei nafshosam. Now what's it? What does it mean iskei nafshosam? Listen to this. This is incredible. Kidei Shlakish. Damar Shlakish. May dichsev bechanfi laage ma'og charak alay shinemo. What does it mean? If you look at Rashi, Rashi says over here bechanfi laage ma'og b'shil chanufas shalegimos ma'og she'achilam v'hish. So I'll say, so how do we know? Literally, it means chanufa or chanifa is flattery. Flattery. So literally, the pasuk over here, the Gemara is quoting from Tilim, "Bechanfi lagi mog charak alei shnimo," because of the flattery. Because of the flattery that Korach showed to his followers, so Charok alai shinimo, he bared his teeth in a smile. The he is a reference to Gehenna. So how did Korach go ahead and onboard? How did Korach onboard his followers? Food and drink. He put out a nice spread in his tent. I don't know, whatever, shlivovitz and poppers, whatever he did in the desert, right? So you go ahead and he put out in the desert, and that's how he went ahead and he onboarded his followers through Hanifa. So in other words, we'll say, because what Hanifa does is sometimes Hanifa speaks to the soul, right? In other words, everybody likes to feel good about themselves. So if somebody goes ahead and flatters me, even if it's not real, it still feels good. Because of the chanufa that Korach went ahead and it was dual flattery. He flattered them, they flattered him, and because of this again, the Sar Shel Gehenna bared its teeth in a smile because Gehenna recognized that it's going to get many more inhabitants. So according to the ones who according to the one who learned out Sreifa, the Sreifa is internal incineration from Bnei Aaron. Where does he know that from? Hashem. So I'll say the pasuk says by Nadav and Avihu that they died before Hashem. Now I'll say now interest of Ke'en Misa. It was like death. What does it mean like? It was like a normal death. Now what does it mean like a normal death? When a person, right? What's a normal death? The body is intact, but the internal processes stop working. That's a normal death. So when Nadav and Avihu died, they died before HaKadosh Baruch Hu, vayamusu, a regular misa, which means everything that happened to them was internal, but externally everything remained the same. V'ida, the other opinion will say, hahu streifa mamishali. No, it's not true. Nadav and Avihu were actually incinerated, fully incinerated. Umay dichsev vayamusu, da'aschiluhu migavai ke'en misa. They're actually incinerated. So what does it mean vayamusu? It means that the incineration began internally and then spread externally. The Sanya, Abi Yossi ben Dostai Omer, Shnei Chutin Shal Eish Yotzim Beis Kodshei HaKadoshim. How did Nadav and Avihu die? They will say now, remember again, all the pasuk says by Nadav and Avihu is Vayakrivu Lefnei Hashem, Vayamusu. They came before Hashem. They came too close. Now again, remember, there's a whole machlok is exactly what it is that they did. So for our purposes now, the infraction is almost irrelevant. What matters is that they died and how they died. So now the Gemara says, how did they die? Two literally again, two pillars of fire emerged from the Holy of Holies in the Mishkan. And split into four. 2 pillars of fire went into the nose of Nadav, 2 into the nose of Avihu, the Sarfam, and burnt them. So the Gemara says, so that's how they died. So in other words, the Gemara is suggesting, again, so the incineration began internally, but at least according to the other opinion, then went ahead and spread externally. The pasuk says it consumed them. Osam velo bigdehem. It consumed them, but not their clothing. So even according to the opinion that says Nadav and Avihu were fully incinerated, it's only them and not their clothing. Incredible. So we'll say. So therefore, again, what we emerge with over here is the good news is everyone agrees, right? Everyone is in agreement. What is everyone in agreement about? That halacha l'maisa sreifa is internal incineration. Right? Hence the process outlined in the Mishnah. Where do we learn it from? Machlokes. Some learn it from Korach. One opinion Korach. One opinion Nadav and Avihu. Okay, so the Gemara says, "I v'neilif mi parim hanisrafim." So it says it's interesting. So why not learn it out from Karbanos? From Param Hanisrafim, so the Gemara says, we have like a paradigm for Sreifa. We burn Karbanos, right? You burn Karbanos. So say by Param Hanisrafim. Then I remember generally, whenever we talk about Parim, it's the Par Helam Davar Shal Tzibor, Par Koin Mashiach. These are generally like sin offerings, right, which are fully consumed. So why not learn out from Param Hanisrafim? Sreifa Mamish, Afkan Sreifa Mamish. So by Param Hanisrafim again, it's total incineration. Total incineration. To which the Gemara says, Mistabra is interesting. Mistabra me Adam Havilei Lemelov, Shekin Adam Chote Neshama Pigel. Because we'll say it makes more sense to learn out the din of Sreifa by people from Adam. Why? Because again, if you learn from Adam, you have four elements. Number one, Adam, they both apply to people. Number one, they're both called Chote, right, sinners. Number three, there's an element of Neshama, right? The Torah is lashon of Neshama. And number four, they're not subject to Pigel. Okay, Adrabah, I can say just the opposite. Be Parman Asrafim Havlei Lemelov. No, learn out from Parman Asrafim. Why? Shekein Machshir Ledoros. Because ultimately, again, Parim, like we have over here, is a Machshir Ledoros. Ultimately, again, tells us, look at Rashi. Rashi's Machshir, it's almost right across in Rashi. Machshir, Sreifas based in Machshir, Hechshir Mitzvahs HaMakom. So remember again, the action of Sreifa, the based in the death penalty, is what we call a Machshir. It's a preparatory act. In other words, it cleanses a person. So too ultimately again Param Hanisrafim. But the Sreifa by Korach and the Sreifa by Nadav and Avihu were not carried out by a Beis Din. They were carried out by a Kadosh Baruch Hu. To which the Gemara says Hanach Lefish. And there are still more comparisons to Sreifa Beis Din, to other cases of people dying than to Parim. Man diolaf mi'adas Korach, my tamal yolaf mimnei Korach. So we'll say, so the one who learns it out from Adas Korach, why doesn't he learn it out from Bnei Aaron? Hahu Sreifa Mamish, because he will say that by Bnei Aaron were actually fully incinerated. Fully incinerated. So the Gemara says v'neiluf minei. So okay, so even if you want to say that Bnei Aaron are fully incinerated, so why not use that as the paradigm? Say that just like Nadav and Avi were fully incinerated. Therefore what? Sreifa means complete incineration. Rav Nachman Rav Baravua Amar Kra v'hapta l're'acha kamocha bar lo misa yafa. So we'll say this keeps coming up over and over, right? Love your fellow like you love yourself, even in death, or even in the way that you have to kill him, which means again, choose for him a more proper death. So the act of internal incineration, we'll say at least does what? It leaves a body for burial. Leaves a body for burial. Person is able to have a levaya, right? As much as they're buried in a separate cemetery, as we saw, but still, nevertheless, that's via haftareacha kamocha. Incredible. V'chimi achar deikad Rav Nachman gzeir shava l'amli. Rav say now we have the position of Rav Nachman. Why didn't gzeir shava at all? Ilav gzeir shava hava mina streifas neshama v'guf kayim lav streifahi. Because were it not. If I didn't have the Gzeir Shava, I would have thought like this, that internal incineration with an intact body is not called Sreifa at all. And again, and without that, I would have just said, because of how do you fulfill V'yaftecha Kamocha? Just add on more wood to the fire. Cause the fire to burn brighter, or to burn more intensely, and therefore, again, the person will die faster. Kamash V'yaftecha Kamocha means internal incineration, but leave the body intact. Okay, so we'll say, so therefore, halacha l'maisa, the bottom line takeaway is everyone is agreeing that Sreifa, the misas bezin of Sreifa, is internal incineration. That's internal incineration. And now the Gemara says, again, what's the mucker for that? So again, that's the machlokes. Is it Nadav and Avihu, or is it Korach? So ultimately, again, that's the machlokes. And interestingly enough, because there's this machlokes, each opinion holds something different happened by the other. So for example, the opinion that says the Makar is Adas Korach, as Korach and his followers, holds that Nadav and Avihu were fully incinerated. And the opinion that says it's Nadav and Avihu hold that Korach's followers were completely incinerated. So fundamental machlokes over historical machlokes, again, so machlokes about the source, but agreement about the halacha. Incredible. Now once the Gemara mentioned Nadav and Avihu, the Gemara tells a little bit of this story. The Kfar Hayu Moshe v'Aaron mahalchin b'derech, v'Nadav v'Avihu mahalchin acharis. So the Gemara tells the story in the desert. Moshe and Aaron are walking. So first of all, say, can you imagine just that scene, right, of being there like a fly on the wall, and Moshe and Aaron are walking together. Imagine just what that must have looked like. So Moshe and Aaron are walking, and what happens? Nadav and Avihu mahalchin acharein. Nadav and Avihu, Aaron's sons, were walking behind them. The Kol Yisrael acharein, and all of Klal Yisrael walking by Nadav and Avihu. Because remember again, Nadav and Avihu were great tzaddikim. Amar lo Nadav la'Avihu, Emasai yamusu shnei zekenim halalu. So Nadav and Avihu say to each other, when are these two old men going to die? Speaking about Moshe and Aaron, when are they going to die? Va'ani va'ata ninhog es hadar. And you and me will go ahead and lead the generation. We'll lead the generation. So we'll say, so just there is so much to say about this Gemara, right? What is this? What is happening over here? And I will say, I just want to point out something amazing, and this is just incredible how the wisdom of Gemara. The Maharsha it's a long Maharsha, but he happens to have this discussion about the fact that Moshe's children did not inherit him. Right? In other words, Moshe's children essentially kind of fade away into obscurity. Right? We don't hear about them. We don't learn about them. They certainly do not become their father. And there's a lot to be said to that in general about the concept of being the children of a great person. You know, on one hand, it could be a source of inspiration. On the other hand, it could be a tremendous source of difficulty. Always living in your father's shadow, never really being able to live up to what he is or what he was. So just this idea over here. So another idea like this. Look, Moshe's kids are not taking over. Moshe's kids are not taking over. And Aaron's kids, we're Aaron's kids. And I will say, the Maharsha says something fascinating. So they saw a fundamental flaw in Moshe and Aaron. On one hand, Moshe obviously wasn't mechanech his kids in the right way, because where are they? By the way, and a tremendous tie-in to the Gemara on the top of the daf that spoke about chinuch, right? Again, you gotta take ownership. Let's say, at the end of the day, you gotta take ownership for how your kids turn out. You don't have to take ownership necessarily for every single decision they made, but you absolutely need to own, to a very large degree, how they turn out in life. That's me. That's on me. Bein l'tov, bein l'ra, that's on me. So another way to say Moshe, obviously Moshe, again, the chinuch is lacking. We're his kids, right? Aaron, Dad, you're great. Listen to this. Dad, you're great, but you're only number two. And you are a career number two. So Moshe can't keep it together with his kids. Aaron, Dad, you're great, but you're only number two. I think it's time for us to step in. Right? I think at the end of the day, both of you are great in your own ways to a degree, but clearly neither of you have discovered the complete secret, right? The secret sauce, so to speak, right? You don't have the secret to success. So, Chevra, maybe it's time for new ideas, new leadership. Stand down. So the Gemara says, Hanira mikover esmi. We'll see who's going to bury who, right? We'll see who's going to bury who, and ultimately, again, who is correct. I will say it's incredible. Amar Papa, Hanudar means she's great. Rav Papa says, people, there's a famous adage. What's the adage? Nefishi gamli sabi de tuuni moshchi dehogni. So I'll say the adage is like this: there are many old camels carrying the hides of young camels. Right? It sounds much better in the Aramaic, right? But the idea is, I'll say, is a lot of times young people think they know everything, right? And yet, again, they know absolutely nothing. There's a lot of old camels carrying the hides of young camels. Right, that lamaisa again. Sometimes I'll say the beauty of youth is an idealism and a recognition that, like, I feel I can conquer the world and I know everything. The challenge of youth is I think I know everything. And sometimes, again, as we get older, we recognize that the truth is we don't know everything. We don't know everything. We know very little. And the truth is there is much to be learned from people who are older than us. Even if they're not, quote unquote, as successful as we think they should have been. But Lamai said there is wisdom that comes with age that youth simply does not have. Incredible Gemara. Rabbi Lazar says, Amr Beis, Lamatam Chacham Doma, as well as incredible Gemara. Lamatam Chacham Doma. To what can a Talmud Chacham be compared? He says, Lifnei Ama So we'll say, so again, this is talking about the relationship between a Talmud Chacham and an Ama Aretz. How is a Talmud Chacham viewed by an Ama Aretz, by an ignorant person? So the Gemara says, Betchila, Dom Lakiton Shalzav. So in the beginning, right? So even an Ama Aretz sees a Talmud Chacham ultimately again as a golden vessel. Siper Himenu, listen to this. When the Talmud Chacham schmoozes with the Ama Aretz, his standing is diminished. I will say, I want to tell you, it's one of the words, I don't know why the word itself bothers me more than anything. Schmoozing, right? Because what does schmoozing sound like? What does schmoozing sound like? It's just like talking for the sake of talking. Why would anyone talk for the sake of talking? If you have something to say it. There's something meaningful to discuss it. But if there's nothing to talk about or there's nothing meaningful, you don't just shoot the breeze. There's no such thing. Shooting the breeze is a fundamental waste of time. If there's a targeted conversation to be had, then have it. But not, again, nothing to do. It's a waste of time. So the Gemara says, this is incredible. If the Ama Aretz sees the Talmud Chacham shooting the breeze, what does that do? It diminishes the standing of the Talmud Chacham. Talmud Chacham doesn't shoot the breeze. He doesn't get together to chapa shmooze, right? If there's something to talk about, let's talk about it. But if there's nothing to talk about, there's not a targeted discussion, then again, there are so many better things to do with one's time. So therefore, the Talmud Chacham shmoozes, shows the Ama Aretz that he doesn't treat his time seriously. It diminishes his standing in the eyes of the Ama Aretz. So let's listen to this. Once the Ama Aretz gives something to Talmud Chacham takes something from the Amar. So in general, human nature is when you give something to someone, so what's the automatic default is? You feel that person owes you something. That person is beholden. It's just human nature. That person is beholden to you. So once the Ama Aretz gives something to Talmud Chacham accepts it, then again now the Talmud Chacham, now the Ama Aretz feels that Talmud Chacham is beholden to him and his status is diminished even more. Ultimately, again, it becomes like an earthenware vessel. Earthenware vessel, once you break it, you can't put it back together. So we'll say, just a tremendous idea, right? So in the beginning, that Talmud Chacham is like a golden vessel of Ama Aretz. Talmud Chacham schmoozes, such he schmoozes, just like shows that he does not take his time seriously. His standing is diminished in the eyes of the Ama Aretz. Takes something from the Ama Aretz, now the Ama Aretz is like, I own you because you took something from me. Then ultimately, a Talmud Chacham becomes like an earthenware vessel. Incredible. So Gemara tells a story. Imrisa bas Tali bas Kohen Shezinsa. So there was this girl. This is literally a person. Her name was Imrasa Bas Tali. She was the daughter of a Kohen who committed adultery. Akfar Rav Chama Bar Tuvia Chavida is Murasa Sarfa. So Rav Achar Bar Tuvia literally again judged her that she was liable to death, surrounded her with branches, and they burnt her. They burnt her. Rav Yosef Ta Betarti. So Rav Yosef says there are two mistakes that are made over here. Number one, Tabid Rav Masna, V'tabid is right, V'tabid Rav Masna. So they made a mistake about Rav Masna. Now remember again, I will say, Rav Masna said that's not how you do Sreifa. Sreifa is not with branches. Sreifa is with lead, with molten lead. So that's number one. That was the first mistake. V'tabid desanya. Ubasal konim v'halavim v'halashofet ha'shei b'yamim ha'hem. Bizman she'esh kohen yesh mishpat. Bizman she'ein kohen ein mishpat. So we'll say, so the other mistake that they made was, Beis Din is not empowered to administer a death penalty until when? Unless, of course, there's a Kohen, there's a Beis Hamikdash, there's a Sanhedrin. So halacha l'maisa again, so two mistakes he made. Number one, he should have administered the death penalty altogether. That's number one. Number two, he did not administer the death penalty in the right way. Incredible. All right, I'm Rabbi Lazar. Rabbi Tzadok, my Seva Bas Kohen Shezinsa. So also Rabbi Lazar says a story Now I will say this is the Mishnah, right? The Mishnah says at the end of the Mishnah, Rabbi Shmuel says there was a story of a Bas Kohen who committed adultery. They surrounded her with branches and they burnt her. And they said back to Rabbi Elazar, Bar Ben Tzadok, that was a mistake of the Beis Din. So says the Gemara as follows: Amar Rav Yosef, Beis Din shel Tzdukim haba. This was a Beis Din of Tzdukim. The Gemara say the Tzdukim were the ones who rejected Torah Sheba'al Peh. They took a very literal interpretation of everything. And halacha l'maaseh, again, this was a Beis Din of Tzdukim. So the Gemara says, Hachi Amar Luvachi Ahadrulei. So I'll say, so this is what he said, and this is what they responded. Vatanya Amar Rabbi Tzadok Zuchrani Keshayisi Tinok Umorkav Akseva Shel Abba. So Rabbi Tzadok says, I remember when I was a child. Right? I remember I was a child. I was riding on my father's shoulders. Ve'viu Bas Kohen Shazinsa V'kifua Chavilei Zmos V'sarfua. And they brought a Bas Kohen who committed adultery, surrounded her with branches, and they burned her. Talk about a traumatic childhood memory. Right? They'll say, so again, I remember I was with my kid and my father on his shoulders, and they burnt the Bas Kohen. So I said to him, okay, thank you, Rabbi Tzadok. You were a child when you saw this, and a person of us is very interesting. We've seen this before. A person is not believed to give testimony as an adult about events they witnessed as a child. Right, that's the halacha. So number one, so therefore they kind of reject that story in its entirety. So the Gemara says, furthermore, Shnei Maisim Havi. Now, the truth is, Rabbi Tzadok, interestingly enough, there are two episodes. He saw this once as a child and saw this once as an adult. The one we just mentioned over here is the one as a child. The one mentioned in the Mishnah is the one he saw as an adult. So the Gemara says, Hey Amru Bereisha, which one did Rabbi Elazar ben Tzadok recount first? The childhood episode or the adult episode? Amrle Kishugad Ovalo Ashkechubei. So the Gemara says, Amrle Kishugad Ovalo Ashkechubei. Amrlehu Kishugad Ovalo Ashkechubei. So again, if you related the adult one first, and they rejected it, they said that was a Beis Din Torah. Would he go ahead and mention anything about the one that happened as a child? Rather again, Ella Ha Amru Bereisha Amrle Katana Isa Amrlu Kishugad Ovalo. Okay, so here's how it happened. Rabbi Tzadok first said, when I was a kid, I remember that they burnt a Bas Kohen. They literally burnt her, and they said, come on, we're not listening to you. You're not believed to talk about as an adult events that you saw as a child. Then again, he saw it a second time when he was a kid, when he was an adult. Then he related, and he said, that was a Beis Din that made a mistake. Okay, good. Mishnah, mitzvahs neragin. So I'll say, so now that was all. That's the end of Sreifa. That's Sreifa. That's how they actually went ahead and carried out the din of Sreifa. Next, mitzvahs haneheragin. So I'll say, now we're up to hereg. Hereg means, bless you, decapitation. So how would they do this? And the Gemara says, they will literally decapitate him with a sword. The Gemara says, first white line, the same way that the monarchy executes people. This is the monarchy executes. You take a sword, sharp sword, you decapitate the individual. Rabbi Huda says, nivel chas shalom. That would create, nivel means that would be a lack of respect to the dead. Just the messiness of decapitation is not going to be good. Ella, rather, what do you do to make it a little bit cleaner? Manichin asrosha alastan. You take a wooden block, you put it in the ground, you tell him to lay his head down on the block. V'kotzeitz bekofitz, and you decapitate him with an axe. Does not seem to be much better, right? They said to Rabbi Yehuda, what are you talking about, right? That's terrible, right? That's a sword could be a lot cleaner. Sword can be a lot cleaner, a lot faster, a lot easier. This is a much, much uglier death. So Tanya, Rabbi Yehuda says as follows: I know that using of the axe is not nice. I know that it's a not nice death. But what should I do? I would also prefer to use a sword. But Rabbi said, there's halacha. What's the halacha? Which means, do not follow in the ways of the Goyim. Do not follow in the ways of the Gentile nations. And since the Gentile nations, when they administer capital punishment, they do decapitation by sword, we're not allowed to do it the same way. So the Gemara says, "V'Rabbanan." Rabbanan said, "What are you talking about? Kevan dechsiv sayif baraisa lo minayu kagamina." No, when are you not allowed to follow in the ways of the Gentile nations? When we just want to replicate what they're doing. But if we're already doing the same thing, or we're doing something and they replicate it, following that standard practice is not considered to be Gentile replication. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, it already says death by a sword in the Torah. So because it says it by us, we're allowed to do it even though they do it. He goes, if you don't say this, listen to this. Had disanya sarfan ala malachim v'lo midarchei mori. So say heichi sarchinan v'aksiv v'bichugosem lo selechu. But remember again, there's an interesting halacha. We actually saw this reference earlier on in the week that halacha l'maisa, when a king dies, we burn the possessions of the king. We burn the possessions. And the logic behind that is, because he's the king, no one else should use his stuff. Now, I will say it's interesting because that's what the Gentile nations do as well, as a sign of respect to the king. But yet we're allowed to do it. Why? Because essentially we had it first. We had it first. So the Gemara says, so you see from here that anything that we were doing already anyway, even if it's done by the Gentile nations, we're still allowed to continue doing it. So the Gemara says, so therefore again, you see over here, like by the burning of the king's possessions, since we already had it first, we were doing it already, even the Gentile nations start to do it, it's not considered to be Gentile replication or emulation. So so to over here, since it says sword, and we'll talk about this more, and we'll talk about this more later on, but since it says sword in the Torah, therefore again, death by sword is something we were already doing, and even though the Gentile nations are now using it as well, it is not considered to be Gentile replication. I will say we'll have to stop over here. I think I'm going to try to record the rest up until the Mishnah Meretz Hashem before Shabbos, so Shabbos can start at the Mishnah. What a week, Shkach, everyone. All right, Chevron on Zoom. Good Shabbos, everyone. Good Shabbos, good Shabbos.
What's a new name for the Chevron on Zoom? We need like a good name for the Chevron on Zoom.
Open. We can put that on the WhatsApp chat. You could